A lonely B-29 makes its way high over Japan. It carries a cargo that will today change forever the manner in which wars are fought and peace is won. Its target, Hiroshima. Three days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The Second World War had come to a close. Ecstatic crowds filled the streets in celebration. The horror and agony that had filled the souls of a populace at war for nearly 4 years was released at last. Returning servicemen, proud of their sacrifice and achievement, continued to wear their uniforms. But now there were no thoughts of war. This was a time for celebration, for vacation, for starting a family and beginning life anew. And if Americans went a little party crazy in the years just following the war, who could blame them? It seemed to many that the dream of a war to end all wars might finally have come to pass. Now no one would dare to attack us or our allies. We had the atomic bomb. Surely there was nothing more to fear. It was time to relax and engage in some well-earned recreation. And we did. But it didn't last. The world remained at peace for only 5 years. There was trouble brewing in a small, divided Asiatic country, a country called Korea. At the end of the war, officers of the two occupying forces in Korea met to coordinate their efforts. The defeated Japanese troops had been caught between the Russians and the advancing Americans. South of the 38th parallel, they had surrendered to the Americans, while north of this point, they were taken by the Soviets. Thus, the armies of occupation formalized this dividing line, which was intended to serve only as a temporary military convenience. But as friendship between the Americans and the communist Russians cooled with time, so this temporary line hardened into a solid and bitterly held border. In the summer of 1950, a well-trained and equipped North Korean army invaded the South. With tanks and heavy artillery, they advanced rapidly against the small South Korean police force. The conclusion was preordained. After a few days of fighting, almost all resistance collapsed. Now the forces of the North marched rapidly southward through the countryside. Recent foreign policy statements by the United States indicated that Korea might not be considered essential to American interest in the East. Therefore, the North Koreans had reason to expect no interference from the West. It was a gamble, nevertheless, that did not pay off. Washington was alerted, and in days, troops and aircraft were sent in. The United Nations Security Council had been boycotted by the Soviet Union, thus lending an automatic abstention to the vote on aid to South Korea. With their opposition absent, the United States motion passed unanimously. The B-29s that flew to Japanese air bases in preparation for their introduction into Korean skies were attached to the Far East Air Force's operations in Japan. They would join the fight under the flag of the United Nations. Escorting them were squadrons of F-80 Shooting Stars. America's first significant jet fighter, operational now for several years, was about to see extended combat for the first time. World War II vintage F-51 fighters, B-26 bombers, and new propeller-driven F-82 twin Mustang fighters were deployed as well. desperate effort to provide support for the early United Nations divisions, F-80 jets and other aircraft provided direct air support, flying ground attack missions against the advancing North Korean army right at the battle line. Within a few days, missions were also flown against the communist lines of supply. We would have to slow up their logistics if we were going to keep our forces from being driven off the South Korean peninsula. Even with this effort, UN and South Korean forces continued to lose ground. We were consciously trading space for time, fighting fiercely, but pulling back when faced with overwhelming odds, slowing their advance as much as possible until sufficient forces could be built up for an all-out counterattack. Soon we could tell that our interdiction efforts on supply lines were forcing a slowdown. And our actions went mostly unopposed from the air, because as a first order of priority, our aircraft had destroyed the small but potentially vicious North Korean Air Force. Eventually, our forces concentrated in a pocket around the southeastern coastal town of Busan. There, a perimeter was established that was held against massive attack from North Korean forces. Meanwhile, B-29 bombers were put to extensive use in the skies. Early in the war, the superforts were given a most unusual role, providing close support, sometimes striking the enemy very near the actual lines of battle. Later, they could add their traditional role of strategic bombers, blasting the limited industrial targets available in the north. This was a preparation for what would come. We had been preparing for it for over 2 months, and now was the time to play our hand at Incheon, over 150 miles behind enemy lines. On the 15th of September 1950, MacArthur initiated his famous surprise attack on Incheon Harbor on the west coast of the Korean Peninsula. A 29-foot tide had to be reckoned with in the deployment of the landing craft. General MacArthur watched as the 1st Marine and 7th Infantry Divisions took the first ground. The Air Force had done its part by hammering the enemy's ground forces, supply lines, and airfields. On the day following the landing at Incheon, the UN forces hemmed in for a month behind the perimeter at Busan broke through. Now, at last, after months of retreat and entrenchment, everything was going our way. And the Air Force had paved the way for the rapid advance that followed as we quickly regained ground and began to push the enemy back up the peninsula. In the upcoming weeks, UN forces advanced rapidly. Now that we were on the offensive again, Air Force C-119 flying boxcars were given a chance to prove their versatility in a new way. This time it was to be a paratroop drop, but no meager operation. We meant to place 4,000 troops ahead in a giant leapfrog action, complete with jeeps, artillery, and all needed supplies to double the speed of our advance. With operations like this, we moved up the peninsula, well past the original 38th parallel and into North Korean territory. By the beginning of November, we had reached portions of the northern border with China. If there were no further intervention, it seemed, Korea might soon be united again under a single flag. If. But that was a mighty big if. It was now 4 months after the start of the Korean conflict. The American aircraft of the United Nations Air Command had been joined by a limited number of planes from other supporting forces. On the afternoon of November 1st, 5 aircraft, an English Mosquito bomber and 4 escorting F-51s, are patrolling near the Yalu River. On the ground, we were wiping up that portion of the North Korean army that had not yet escaped over the border into Red China. But on the other side of that border, recent intelligence informed us China was massing troops, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Was it a bluff? Would China actually send troops against the United Nations knowing that the U.S. possessed the atom bomb? We were locked into a position of wait and see. The patrol that flew along the Yalu that afternoon thought their job was mostly routine. They were keeping an eye out for any movement across the bridges that spanned the river from China to Korea. But many people were certain the war was almost over. General MacArthur believed the Chinese were only bluffing. He had promised that American troops would be home by Christmas. That sure sounded good. But then suddenly...
Red leader, 2 o'clock, a bogey. Gee, that's bad. Look at that sucker go! I've never seen anything that fast before.
As they headed back to base, the pilots knew they'd take their Christmas dinner in the officers' mess. This was going to be a whole new war. They had heard reports about it, but none had seen it before. This was the new MiG-15, the world's first operational swept-wing jet fighter, nearly 200 miles per hour faster than the fastest Mustang. Now it was here, and there was only one thing to do: bring out the F-80s. That very next day, we did. F-80s went out looking for MiGs, but the Russian-built jets found them first. Nevertheless, we fought and won. It didn't take long to size up the situation. We were winning these early jet-to-jet air battles because of the experience and skill of our pilots. But our frontline F-80 jet was decidedly inferior to the MiG. The Mikoyan-Gurevich design was faster by almost 100 miles per hour. It had a much higher operational ceiling. It was smaller and lighter, and it could outclimb our planes by more than 1,000 feet per minute. The real losers in this contest were the B-29 bombers. The MiGs wreaked havoc on them, diving down from 50,000 feet at speeds nearing Mach 1. The big superforts were like sitting ducks. After suffering heavy losses, B-29 raids had to be discontinued until another solution could be found. The introduction of the MiG-15 was a shock to our commanders. Our current F-80 was clearly no match for it. Only the considerable skill and experience of our pilots kept us from suffering heavy fighter losses. As for the old beloved F-51 Mustang, its days were numbered. The game was going to be played by jets now, and we needed an ace in the hole. Fortunately, we were prepared. Just coming online was the new F-86 Sabre jet. The Sabre created the name and the form of what was to become one of the most famous family of aircraft of any era. Back in 1945, North American Aviation, builders of the Mustang, had proposed several new designs for a straight-wing jet fighter. Shortly afterwards, captured German research data on experiments with swept-wing designs were brought to the North American team. It was decided to use this data to create a whole new jet. To the basic fuselage, a set of wings, gracefully swept back at 35 degrees, were added. The jet engine sat behind the pilot, and the air intake was moved right up front to the nose. Working out all the details of a radical new design took time, however. The first prototype wasn't ready until 1948. Even before this, North America had in their hands a contract to produce 188 Sabres. Now it was time to see how this new bird really flew. In May 1948, the first two Sabres were delivered to the U.S. Air Force. In the hands of Air Force test pilots, this powerful gleaming bird swept aloft. Its J-35 engine thrust it to speeds of which pilots just a few years before could only dream. The new jet could be loaded up to deliver its punch with underwing rockets. Or it could carry two 500-pound bombs. But its primary mission was as a fighter interceptor. And to do that job, it was given 6 50-caliber machine guns, 3 mounted on either side of the nose. Now, the Sabre was ready to take its place in the arena of combat. At the start of the war in Korea, the Sabre was on duty with only 3 of America's 25 air wings, and all of them in the States. Within days of the first MiG combat, Sabres were being shipped to Korea. Taking off from Kimpo Airfield in South Korea, the Sabres met the MiGs in combat. We were fairly certain the F-86 would prevail, but how well would they do? We had only a few hundred Sabres to commit to the battle. Estimates suggested that the Chinese might have as many as 1,000 MiGs. The verdict was not long in coming. The Chinese and North Koreans were losing aircraft at a rate of 4 MiGs to every Sabre down. But on the ground, it was a different story. Waves of Chinese infantry poured across the border, and the United Nations forces were pushed back by the sheer pressure of their numbers. As this pullback proceeded, we lost desperately needed air bases, and Navy aircraft carriers took over the air support duties. The naval aircraft, including the F-9F Panther jet, were not the equal of the Sabre, but they did a valiant job. The loss of land bases had revealed the Sabre's Achilles heel. These early jets were fuel-hungry, forcing a limited combat radius. Our air raids were aimed at the North Koreans' lines of supply as near to the northern border as was possible without actually straying into Chinese territory. Months went by, and slowly we regained much of the land and many of the air bases we had lost. As they prepared for each day's mission, the aviators could not help but think of the source of the material and supplies they were preparing to bomb. It was in China. But China had the backing of its Soviet allies, and they had served notice that any incursion on Chinese soil would invite Soviet involvement, thus widening the war even further. In the last 40 years, the world had twice been racked by global war. Could it really happen again? Would we want it if it could be avoided? The men on the ground may have thought about these questions, but the answers were not theirs to choose. Their job was to fly and fight, and now that the Sabre was back on Korean soil, they knew they could do it, and do it well. The war was beginning to settle into a bloody but predictable pattern. On the ground, it was fought ridge by ridge, and progress was slow. In the air, circumstances created a static battlefield in the far north of the country, between the Yalu and Chongchon rivers, a field on which were fought the first large-scale jet-to-jet dogfights in history. We gave this battlefield a name. We called it MiG Alley. Each day, the Sabres took off from Kimpo or Suwon in the south, flying the 200-mile distance to MiG Alley in a matter of minutes. Now, with additional fuel and ejectable external tanks, the Sabres had more time to stay on station. But this was a question of minutes, not hours. The MiGs were stationed just north of the Yalu, across the Chinese border in sanctuary bases, off limits to the F-86s. At their discretion and in perfect safety, they could take off and climb above the Sabre ceiling, crossing the border only when they had achieved this advantage. Over the months, the communists tried out many different tactics. It wasn't long before U.S. pilots realized that they were facing adversaries of 3 nationalities. There were North Koreans and Chinese, some fresh out of flight academy. But increasingly, F-86 radios picked up foreign cockpit chatter in Russian. And some of these pilots were definitely no novices. While the F-86 was a step up from the old F-80 model, early Sabres were still slower and less maneuverable than the MiG-15. The 6 machine guns worked well, but sometimes it seemed you could pour hundreds of rounds up the tail of a MiG and it would keep on flying. By contrast, the Russian-built plane carried 1 37 and 2 23mm cannons under its nose. Though they suffered from a slow rate of fire and a severely limited ammo load, it could take no more than 1 well-placed shot to down an American plane. Fortunately, this didn't happen often. In spite of their best efforts and numerical superiority, the MiG pilots seemed incapable of winning consistently against the Americans. In fact, they were losing badly. Our boys had raised the kill ratio to 10-1. What was it that gave us such advantage in the air? The plane was part of the answer. But a tool is only a tool. It takes unparalleled skill, training, and determination to bring out its best. It was the men.
Oh, fighter sweep today. In this area right here. We'll start engines as indicated on the board. Here's the plan. Tiger flight, you take off, up to this area here, right on up to here, where you make a right turn, come about 30 miles inland, look back in. Eagle flight, you'll follow Tiger, you'll come up this area here, up to this point here where you make a left turn, look back in. The last 2 flights, Wolf and Robin, will take off and come up the center, this point here, where they'll cut right up in to the Yalu River, cutting short of the Yalu, where they'll split, one doing a right turn, and Wolf will make a left turn. Now, the first 4 flights into the area will stay below the contrails and keep a close watch on the fighter bombers. The last 2 flights will go above the contrails and check very closely for any MiG aircraft that might come in above the cons. Now, if you see MiGs up there today, call them out. Give their altitude, direction, and geographical location on the map. And call them out and then get off the radio. Now remember, once you look around, keep your speed up. And if you do get a bounce, cut him off and drive in range. When you get in range, shoot, and when you shoot, shoot to kill. Anybody got any questions? Okay, let's go get them. As time went on, new and improved models of the Sabre were introduced into combat.
A more powerful engine and a redesigned wing brought the performance of the Sabre to a level equal to, or in some respects superior, to that of the adversary. Hundreds of American pilots who bore the brunt of the United Nations air effort engaged over the years in thousands of sorties. In all, 39 pilots carried away the title of Jet Ace, downing the requisite minimum of 5 enemy planes apiece. Top honors went to Captain J.D. McConnell, Jr., a triple ace with 16 MiGs to his credit.
Going down. You got him? All right, boy, that's a good deal. Watch it. We got 4 of them coming in here on at 7 o'clock. Hang on. Go ahead and take it, and I'll cover you. All right, I'm going in now. Okay, he's down, boy. You got him too.
The air battles continued as the ground war stalled, and peace talks were begun. It all ended in late July 1953, a little over 3 years after it had begun. Our first limited war had ended in a draw. The communist attack had failed. There were still 2 Koreas, and they were still divided near the 38th parallel. But now, at long last, our men could come home. For nearly 3 years, our Air Force pilots had run the gauntlet of MiG Alley, Korea. They emerged victorious. Their determination and valor had held the line and helped our suit for peace. Truly, they owned the sky.